What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Fantasy Football Fellas YouTube channel. My name is Tyler Plath, and Bipocalypse Part 2 is on the way in Week 13. We got 6 teams on bye. Baltimore, Buffalo, Minnesota, Chicago, Vegas, and the New York Giants are on bye. That means we've got some big names on bye. Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, Josh Jacobs, all the sorts. They are all on bye, so we may need to pivot and find a spot start or two. And these guys that we are going to discuss in this video can certainly fill the void. Before I begin, make sure you're subscribed. Have that notification bell turned on as well, because fantasy playoffs are right around the corner. So wins, points, lineups, all of that matter now more than ever, and we are here to help you out along the way. And so with that, we're going to start with Packers wide receiver Jayden Reed, who's been on a tear recently. He's the wide receiver 33 on the year now, and over the last 3 weeks, he's averaging nearly 18 fantasy points per game. He's the wide receiver 10 in that stretch, the wide receiver 15 in points per game. That's likely his ceiling, 18 fantasy points. But we are getting a pretty decent floor with Jayden Reed as well. Ever since the Packers came back from their bye week in Week 7, Jayden Reed has finished as the wide receiver 34 or better in all but one game. So we're getting a pretty good ceiling and a really decent floor as well with Jayden Reed. And if that's not enough of a reason, let me explain this. There is no true wide receiver one in this Packers offense. They are spreading the ball around to, quite literally, everybody. Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Jayden Reed, they all have a 16% target share in this offense, which means that there is plenty of opportunity for Jayden Reed to be the dominant receiver or to have the best fantasy performance of any Packer wide receiver. We take a look at Week 12, 15 fantasy points for Jayden Reed, 4 receptions, 8 targets, 34 yards, with a touchdown and 16 rushing yards. The touchdown, you could argue, saved him. But think about it this way. We're looking at 9, 10, 11 fantasy points without the touchdown. That's probably going to be a wide receiver 30-something finish on a week. You add in a score, like it happened in Week 12, 15, and then you're looking at a top 25 fringe finish. That is what Jayden Reed will provide for the rest of the year, as long as the Green Bay Packers continue to spread the ball around and not have a true wide receiver one in their offense. And speaking of this Packers offense, we're going to talk about Jordan Love next. And Jordan Love, I think, has suffered a bit from the he's not doing well as an NFL quarterback narrative that can pop up in fantasy football, which I don't really understand, because really fantasy football doesn't really matter. It doesn't care if you don't pass the eye test in the NFL. You can go 21 for 40 in a losing effort, but you can still put up almost 300 yards and 2 touchdowns and still have a semi-productive fantasy performance. That's what happened with Jordan Love in Week 10 against the Pittsburgh Steelers. He was 21 of 40 for 289 yards and 2 touchdowns, good for 18.7 fantasy points on the week and a quarterback 12 finish. So fantasy football, first and foremost, does not care about how well someone passes your eye test. If you can put up 300 yards and put the ball into the end zone, you're still going to do well in fantasy football. The other part of this is that Jordan Love has been playing better recently. And I know that might sound like I'm contradicting myself, but just take a look at his last 2 games against the Chargers and against the Lions. 27 of 40 for 322 yards and 2 touchdowns against the Chargers. 22 of 32 for 268 and 3 touchdowns against the Lions. I bring up those stats because I want you to understand that the days of, he's not a great NFL quarterback, those days are over when it comes to fantasy football, because what he continues to do in fantasy football is produce. So if you need a quarterback, right, Josh Allen on bye, Lamar Jackson on bye, Josh Dobbs on bye, Jordan Love is a great option. Enough of the Packers, because this is a very pro-Vikings channel. Let's look at 2 players who played on Thanksgiving, just like the Packers, but in a different game, in the Washington and Dallas game. And we're going to first start with Curtis Samuel, in the mystery that is Curtis Samuel. It continues to live on. He put up 9 receptions on 12 targets for 100 yards in the loss to the Dallas Cowboys. And He's been super, super hard to predict this year because he leads Washington in targets per route run, but he's only doing so on a 13% target share, which is 4th on his team. But I think the secret sauce is that Curtis Samuel is very game script dependent, very situation dependent. You take a look at his best performances this year. Week 4, the wide receiver 11 on the week, that was a 34-31 loss to Philly. Week 5, wide receiver 14, that was a 40-20 loss to Chicago. Week 12, wide receiver 16 finish on the week, a 45-10 smacking against Dallas. These are all games where Washington either needs to throw the ball to have any chance of staying alive in the game, or they're down big. And we take a look at next week's opponent, it's the Miami Dolphins. So yes, Washington will need to continue throwing the ball if they want to keep up with Miami. Curtis Samuel may be more of a deeper league guy than just a 10 or 12 man standard league, but I think the game lines up for Curtis Samuel to at least find some kind of fantasy production, because again, Washington is going to need to throw the ball, and when that happens, Curtis Samuel is a beneficiary of that. And the second player from this Washington-Dallas game is Rico Dowdle, Dallas running back. And I'm going to do my very best to not get frustrated while talking about Rico Dowdle, because all of my Tony Pollard shares are crying out in agony. But he has firmly cemented himself in premier handcuff territory. We all know that this backfield belongs to Tony Pollard, but if you are a Tony Pollard manager like I am, it would be very, very wise to add Rico Dowdle to your team, not only in case something happens to Tony Pollard, but in the scenario that we continue to see more of Rico Dowdle. Week 12, Rico Dowdle's snap share was down to about his season average, which is about 20%, according to our friends at Matthew Berry's Fantasy Life. Shout out to them and all the great tools that they have over there. But from weeks 8 to 11, Rico Dowdle's snap share jumped up to 27%. Rico Dowdle was more involved in those weeks than any of the other weeks so far this year. And if that's something that's going to continue, as a Tony Pollard manager, you need to have that on your bench just in case anything happens, especially as we get closer and closer to fantasy playoffs. Rico Dowdle needs to be on your team if you have Tony Pollard. The Muth, Pat Freiermuth, is next, and the recent change in play callers in Pittsburgh may benefit Pat Freiermuth the most. In the first game with new play calling, Pat Freiermuth finished with 9 receptions on 11 targets for $120 in yards. And Freiermuth really took on what we like to call as the safety valve role in this offense. 7 of his 9 receptions were between 0 and 9 yards of the line of scrimmage. That role is very similar to what we see with guys like TJ Hawkinson, Mark Andrews before he got hurt, and guys like Trey McBride and Dalton Kincaid as of late. Now, Pat Freiermuth doesn't have the easiest schedule ahead. He has the likes of Arizona and New England and Baltimore up ahead, and they do a very good job of not allowing a lot of fantasy points to tight ends. But even if that's still 8, 9, 10 fantasy points, it's worth it. And then when you get the matchups like he has with Indianapolis, Cincinnati, and Seattle, you can expect bigger performances. Pat Freiermuth is emerging at the right time for those of us that had a Mark Andrews or a Dallas Goedert, who is probably going to be out at least another week or two. Or maybe you're just stuck with a guy like Kyle Pitts. Pat Freiermuth is emerging at the right time, and he is your guy if you need a tight end. And especially if you have a TJ Hawkinson or a Dalton Kincaid in Week 13. All right, let's fly through these last 3 guys, starting with Arizona Cardinals wide receiver Greg Dortch. And over the last 2 weeks, Dortch leads the team in target share and has seen a season high in routes. Now, this may be due to the absence of Michael Wilson, but the Cardinals are going to be throwing the ball a lot the rest of the season because they're just going to be playing from behind a ton. Their next games, Pittsburgh, Week 13. Then they have a bye in Week 14. San Francisco, Chicago, and Philly in the following weeks. Greg Dortch is by no means a must-add, But he's one to keep an eye on moving forward, especially if Michael Wilson continues to miss time, because what Greg Dortch has done in his absence is only produced in fantasy football. Then we've got Royce Freeman, who is now the running back 2 in the Rams backfield and has a very similar argument as Rico Dowdle. Handcuff value. Kyren Williams returned from the IR in week 12, and he didn't disappoint. He put up over 200 total scrimmage yards. He found the end zone twice, I believe, maybe once. But it was reported by Tom Pelissero before week 12 kicked off on Sunday that this Rams backfield would be a 2-to-1 split in favor of Kyren Williams, and the rest would be for Royce Freeman. And sure enough, that's exactly how it played out. Freeman on the day still finished with 13 carries, 77 rushing yards, and a touchdown. If this backfield stays at this 2-to-1 ratio, and with how well Freeman has done with his touches really on the year, he's averaging 4.5 yards per carry, there's some standalone value for Royce Freeman, and on top of that, he is suddenly one of the most valuable handcuffs because we saw what happens if Kyren Williams goes down. It's then Royce Freeman and Darrell Henderson in that backfield. So, again, you may want to consider adding Royce Freeman if you have Kyren Williams, just in case that this 2-to-1 ratio split continues. Don't be surprised if it all goes back to Kyren Williams eventually. But again, you have nothing to lose by adding Royce Freeman because at the worst, let's say Royce Freeman gets hurt, someone else picks up Royce Freeman, you're then out of luck on a running back. And the last player is Texans wide receiver Noah Brown, who missed the last 2 games with an injury, so keep that in mind. But before getting hurt, Noah Brown was the wide receiver 3 during weeks 9 and 10. The wide receiver 3. Now, when he gets back, he's then the wide receiver 3 on the Houston Texans behind Nico Collins and Tank Dell. But there's enough of the ball going around currently in Houston for him to stay relevant. Houston currently ranks 12th of all teams in team plays per game and passing attempts. Of all 32 teams, they rank 12th. And because they can't get much on the ground, they're going to continue throwing the ball, which only means good things for these Texans wide receivers. They've got some tough matchups coming up. They've got Denver next week, then they've got the Jets, so 2 back-to-back tough matchups. Then they get Cleveland in the middle of fantasy playoffs. So that's 3 relatively tough matchups. But getting Tennessee twice in fantasy playoffs only spells good things for Tank Dell, Nico Collins, and even Noah Brown. So again, he has been injured the last couple weeks, so make sure that he's fully healthy when you add him. But if he's fully healthy, he's going to produce because this offense can support it. That'll do it for this video. A little bit of a shorter list than usual with only 8 guys instead of 10, but the players that we discussed in this video: Jayden Reed, Jordan Love, Curtis Samuel, Rico Dowdle, Pat Freiermuth, the Muth himself, Greg Dortch, Royce Freeman, and Noah Brown. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe if you are not already, and have that notification bell turned on because, like I said at the top, fantasy playoffs are right around the corner, and we are here to help you out to not only get the best lineups, to win your matchups and stuff like that, but to get to the playoffs and make a push for the championship. We will see you on our next video, which is the newest episode of the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast. You don't want to miss that. So until then, deuces.